Hi, everyone. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to today's webinar, Funding and Financing Strategies for Integrated Hazard Mitigation and Water Resource Plans. My name is Owen Volk from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now, for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Natalia Sanchez, Program Manager at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center. Welcome, Natalia. I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, bear with me just 1 second while I share my screen. Are you seeing my slides, Owen?
It looks good on our end.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Owen, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending this webinar funding and financing strategies for integrated hazard mitigation and water resource plans. My name is Natalia Sanchez, and I'm a program manager at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, and we serve all of EPA's Region 3, which are the Mid-Atlantic states. So this webinar is intended to show how local decision makers can pay for integrated hazard mitigation and water resource projects. It will cover basic principles and strategies to address your community's funding needs and move you from planning to implementation. I will also provide examples of how communities have adopted these strategies to protect source water, to mitigate flooding, and to tackle a number of other local issues. In the developing a balanced funding and financing strategy section, I will mostly use some case studies and examples from state and municipal governments. However, by the time I get to the actual case studies section, I will share examples from a few wastewater utilities to demonstrate how these strategies can be effective both at the municipal sector and at the water utility sector. And as Owen already mentioned, I'll leave time at the end for questions. So what exactly is a hazard mitigation and water resource plan, and why is it beneficial? Integrated planning is an approach to planning that provides a comprehensive view of resources and commitments to ensure financial and capital resources are aligned with community priorities. As opposed to a fragmented planning process, which is typical in most communities, integrated planning incorporates elements that are common to multiple planning objectives, in this case, hazard mitigation and water management, to align common elements and identify mutual or overlapping activities. Integrating hazard mitigation and water resource planning comes with a number of community co-benefits. It helps to reduce confusion and redundancies in community priorities. It creates a broader range of support since it draws on a larger set of community goals. It reduces hazard impacts and addresses water quality mandates, and it increases overall community resilience. Integrated planning also has significant economic benefits. Because the plans and strategies are integrated, it helps to streamline resource allocation and coordinates available project funding to accomplish more than one goal. It allows communities to leverage different funding sources that may not have been considered for a single benefit program and increases access to financing options. For example, you might be able to tap into a local source water protection grants and federal hazard mitigation technical assistance programs to implement the same project because you have identified the issue as both a water quality and a mitigation challenge in your integrated plan. It allows communities to scale water and hazard mitigation projects to facilitate access to additional resources, attract large-scale investors, and potentially shift away from funding to financing. And some utilities are even integrating plans with other communities and partners in the area to achieve greater scale. Regional climate collaboratives are a great example of this strategy. To address the problems of increasing and extreme weather events, communities across the country are working together at a regional scale to put in place coordinated policies across multiple jurisdictions. By moving beyond the fragmented planning and development programs, communities can achieve integrated solutions to address climate change while overcoming limited resources and technical capacity needs. So I already mentioned that most communities generally use a fragmented planning process that only looks at one general issue at a time. For example, either stormwater or drinking water or community resilience independently. While there are many models for planning, they all typically break down into 5 major steps. First, you identify issues and existing conditions. Next, you describe your needs and state your planning goals. Third, you collect and evaluate potential strategies. Fourth, you develop your plan with recommended solutions. And fifth, after all of that, you then adopt the plans after some community comment period. It's not until after a plan is adopted that we typically think about implementation, including timelines for strategy adoption, project financing, and monitoring and evaluation. That means whenever we talk about project finance and budgeting, it is after we have undergone the typical planning process. This often leaves us chasing the money. It's a very common problem. We undergo an elaborate planning process, have well thought out strategies, but then we can't implement our solutions because we haven't gone through the various funding and financing sources. As communities across the country face increasing costs associated with maintaining safe and clean water, preparing for extreme weather events, and managing failing infrastructure systems, we need to mobilize support and resources around plans that can address these growing concerns comprehensively. Rather than maintaining the typical planning process, where a community develops the plan first and then considers implementation and costs after the fact, it is important that we shift the discussion about financing and funding earlier on in the planning process. This can help us integrate community goals, leverage project funds, and reduce overall implementation costs. Incorporating funding and financing strategies into integrated planning efforts will enable communities to successfully implement projects, build resilience, and respond to potential threats, all while maximizing efficiency. So if your community has already assessed its climate risks and vulnerabilities and developed an integrated hazard mitigation and water management plan to preserve government services and protect people and property against flooding, extreme storms, drought, and heat, the information in this webinar can help identify opportunities to pay for those proposed strategies and recommendations. But if your community has not yet completed an integrated hazard mitigation and water management plan, the information in this presentation can help inform your plan development process and enable you to consider what types of funding and financing strategies you may want to integrate early on. So the incorporating finance into integrated plans is a three-step process. First, to integrate funding and financing earlier on in the planning process, you will want to identify general costs as part of the data collection process and develop estimated budgets. Insufficient funding and the lack of a strategic financing plan is often a barrier to implementing projects. However, once your community has identified specific hazard and water resource concerns and developed potential interventions to address these concerns, you can determine cost estimates of specific actions and overlapping strategies. To do this effectively, you're going to want to identify overlapping strategies and interventions, consider the types of costs for each planned intervention, including capital costs like equipment, project identification, and land acquisition, labor like new and existing staff, contractors, or any other service providers, and operations and maintenance such as asset management software and equipment maintenance. You want to develop a comprehensive budget for the first year as well as a long-term budget projection to include inflation and additional contingencies. The second step is to conduct a basic benefit cost analysis to thoroughly evaluate potential strategies prior to proposing solutions. Funding will likely depend on the benefits or the avoided losses your community can demonstrate. Understanding the expected outcomes of your integrated hazard mitigation and water resource strategies can help your community prioritize projects with the greatest impact and focus your plan on the implementation of high impact practices. You're going to want to assess the qualitative and quantitative benefits of the proposed implementation strategies. This includes reviewing historical loss records, national case studies, and other available data sources. You want to include up-to-date climate change projections to accurately account for future risks mitigated by the proposed implementation strategies. And you want to attempt to monetize typically unquantified social and environmental benefits. Consider potential funder guidelines for benefit valuation. So for example, FEMA benefits are mainly the avoided losses of the National Federal Insurance programs insured structures, which are easily quantified, and they have very specific guidelines for benefit valuations to generate a numeric BCA or benefit cost analysis value. Other funding sources, such as EPA grants or state revolving loans, do not use formal numeric benefit cost analyses, but have more qualitative requirements for assessing project benefits. Lastly, you're going to want to compare future benefits of proposed projects to the implementation costs. If the BCA is greater than 1, the likelihood of securing funding is improved. If the BCA is less than 1, it may be advantageous to look at alternatives to increase benefits, such as identifying more stakeholders or co-benefits, or reducing costs, such as partially funding the project from another source, or identifying in-kind services to reduce the funds requested. If possible, consider doing a total cost-benefit analysis that attempts to monetize typically unquantified social and environmental costs and benefits, and the estimated costs and benefits over the lifetime of an asset rather than over a specified period of time. There are several tools available to help you complete this type of analysis. And if you are interested in pursuing this, I recommend that you reach out to your region's Environmental Finance Center. At the end of this presentation, I'm also including a list of resources that can help you do this type of analysis. And then the third and final step is you want to develop a basic funding strategy and incorporate it into your plan. It is important to identify a wide set of funding and financing mechanisms and determine how to best combine them to cover costs and allow you to prioritize options. A well-defined funding strategy may be required by specific funding sources, and even if it is not required, developing a detailed funding strategy will help match projects with appropriate funding sources and ensure efficient implementation of the Integrated Hazard Mitigation and Water Resource Plan. You want to avoid limiting your options too soon. Consider cost-saving approaches, revenue streams, and innovative strategies. See what is out there and think about a blended portfolio approach that combines multiple sources of funding and financing options to cover the cost. Understand how funding sources can and cannot be combined. For example, some grants are not to be combined with other federal grants to fund a single project, and there are restrictions on what can be used as matching funds. You want to identify available clearinghouses for your state's grants and loans. Again, your Regional Environmental Finance Center can help connect you to some of those resources. And lastly, you want to identify and develop a strategy to fill any major funding gaps. It is also important to understand what funding and finance options are available to your community. So funding are the financial sources that do not require repayment. These are things like taxes, fees, and grants. And financing is the acquisition of money for a program or project that does require repayment of principal and interest. So these are things like loans and bonds. To develop a sustainable financing and funding strategy, you will want to consider your desired activities and associated budget needs, existing sources of funding or in-kind support, and your community's appetite for new revenue programs. In the next section of this webinar, I'm going to highlight key financing and funding strategies and examples of communities that are successfully utilizing these approaches to implement projects. So the mechanisms are going to be broken down into two main categories. First, I'm going to cover cost reducers. And these are cost reduction strategies that increase a program's efficiency and reduce its overall costs. While not explicitly sources of funding, these approaches can help stretch public funds and leverage outside resources. Then I'm going to cover revenue streams, which are the mechanisms used to generate and access capital for project implementation. Keep in mind that while you may be familiar with several of the common financing approaches, this webinar is intended to build a basic understanding of the various strategies so that you can, one, incorporate financing considerations into earlier stages of the planning process, and two, combine and leverage strategy strengths that can help reinforce the implementation of comprehensive plans. Assembling the appropriate mix of cost reduction and funding strategies is highly dependent on a community's particular needs and characteristics. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. So first, I will talk about cost reducers, and these are strategies that can increase effectiveness and reduce spending. It is important to think comprehensively and creatively, as well as to incorporate multiple objectives and long-term needs when looking for mechanisms to reduce costs. Some cost reducers may require larger initial investment of time and resources, but it is important to incorporate the long-term savings that they may generate. So the first cost reducer I'll talk about is comprehensive planning. Comprehensive plans address growth, land use needs, and the increasing impacts posed by water resource management and extreme natural events can help reduce costs. Comprehensive plans are the mother of all integrated plans and therefore share many of the community and financial benefits discussed earlier in the webinar. Namely, they clarify priorities, establish commitments, recommend integrated strategies, provide a single point of stakeholder engagement rather than one for each project alone, and facilitates coordination amongst departments. Communities can use this planning process to explicitly address their hazard mitigation and water resource needs. By incorporating such challenges into the local comprehensive plans, solutions can then be incorporated into long-term plans, which will increase cost effectiveness and save unnecessary expenses in future years. So 2 examples of comprehensive planning can be found in the states of Washington and Maryland, both of which have a long record of requiring additional integrated elements into their comprehensive planning processes. So starting in 1990, the state of Washington established a Growth Management Act, which required each city and county within the state to prepare a comprehensive plan that regulates development, conserves natural resources, and guides economic growth, designating critical areas for protection, including frequently flooded areas, geologically hazardous areas, and critical aquifer recharge areas. Maryland's smart growth legislation, which was enacted in 1997, focused on incentives rather than regulations by targeting state funding to encourage growth and investment in existing urbanized areas while encouraging the preservation of rural legacy areas. Smart growth helps to concentrate development and conserve open space in priority funding areas, which require sewer and water plans, all of which aim to limit sprawl and reduces impervious surface and pollution from runoff, which helps stormwater systems and water quality. Next, I'll talk about capital improvement programs. A capital improvement program identifies and prioritizes a community's needs for publicly financed physical infrastructure. By coordinating investment projects across multiple priorities, capital improvement plans can help reduce redundancies and increase efficiencies. So think about how many of you are involved in the capital improvement or CIP process. And if you are, you try to adopt a dig once approach and to take into consideration the risks of natural hazards. Then you can lower the cost project implementation and ensure your investments are more secure over time. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term dig once, it refers to actively incorporating additional benefits to pre-scheduled infrastructure projects. For example, if your community is expected to undergo road maintenance where the ground will need to be excavated, then this presents an opportunity to integrate green infrastructure to address stormwater runoff, change out old drinking water infrastructure, or even possibly lay down new broadband lines. This approach of piggybacking additional benefits on an existing project allows you to leverage existing funding, leads to greater efficiency and to overall cost reduction. Communities could develop capital improvement plan evaluation criteria that prioritize projects that address hazard mitigation and water quality concerns to ensure that these considerations are embedded into all future capital projects. 2 examples of capital improvement programs include here in Prince George's County, Maryland, we amended our county code in 2012 with a complete streets ordinance that improves green streets and pedestrian safety under planning for roads and sidewalks. The ordinance directs county officials to incorporate environmental site design into road, trail, sidewalk, and transit construction projects to ensure that stormwater runoff is well managed and that roads are accessible to everyone, including bicyclists and pedestrians. Communities projected to face increasingly heavy precipitation events due to climate change can use this ordinance as a model of how to incorporate green streets provisions into their local codes. The state of Vermont also established its hazard mitigation plan in 2018. which is implemented by collaborative efforts among different state agencies. Among other measures identified in the plan, municipal planning and capital improvements incorporate the use of a river corridor tool and a road infrastructure tool, which are designed to identify sites most vulnerable to flood damage. Next is cooperative procurement and interlocal resource sharing. And these are tools that local governments can use to reduce time, administrative overhead, and other costs. Cooperative purchasing combines the requirements of 2 or more public entities to leverage the benefits of volume purchases, delivery and supply chain advantages, best practices, and the reduction of administrative time and expenses. Cooperatives can pool demand for a product or service in order to get lower prices from suppliers. For example, several local governments in a watershed could work collaboratively to hire a contractor to design bioretention areas and benefit from a better negotiating position. Interlocal service agreements where the participants agree to share service responsibility or contract with a neighboring government to provide the service to the other jurisdiction. An example of interlocal resource sharing is when several smaller jurisdictions purchase one snowplow, which is shared. Similar to cooperative purchasing, interlocal service agreements can increase economies of scale and can help to provide high service levels, optimization of facilities, and increased accountability. So Minnesota's watershed districts have provided cost-sharing funding to cities, counties, and other entities for stormwater management practices. The Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition was formed to help cities manage their requirements under the federal MS4 permit requirements, rather than have each city hire a consultant of its own. While many people think of public-private partnerships as a financing mechanism, they're actually a cost reducer. So the value of public-private partnership is the ability to bundle together the design, build, financing, operations, and maintenance of an infrastructure asset in a more cost-effective way than the public sector can do it. A well-structured public-private partnership, also known as a P3, will have both partners sharing the risks and rewards of the implemented projects. The local government usually maintains ownership over the asset, and the private company is responsible for one or more aspects of the project implementation that may include design, financing, construction, operation, or maintenance. The private company receives from the local government a regularly scheduled concession payment, usually funded by a toll, user fee, repayment tax, or tax revenue. Municipalities are attracted to public-private partnerships because they defer upfront costs, and investors are attracted because of the high level of transparency, investment premiums, and secured repayment streams. In addition to the traditional public-private partnership, local jurisdictions may want to explore community-based P3s, which go beyond the basic requirements of a P3 to include the alignment of goals, accountability, transparency, and sustainability. Community-based P3s are thus uniquely positioned to address environmental community-based challenges. So in 2012, Prince George's County in Maryland created a Clean Water Partnership as a groundbreaking community-based public-private partnership program to meet regulatory requirements by leveraging private sector resources and promoting operational efficiencies and innovation in design, construction, and maintenance. The county needed to retrofit 15,000 acres of impervious surface area in order to comply with Clean Water Act regulations, but was also interested in investing into communities and building a local workforce capable of maintaining the green infrastructure. The public-private partnership relies on funding from a stormwater utility. The county provides the oversight, and Corvia Solutions manages the infrastructure investments, providing ways to streamline costs and improve the efficiency of the investments. All right, the next cost reducer are rebates and tax credits, which provide incentives for communities and private property owners to make investments or adopt certain best management practices that benefit the community. By helping people to get part of their money back in the form of rebates and tax relief of various kinds, local governments can make it easier for residents to spend money on or contribute to environmental projects, both reducing the cost to the jurisdiction and increasing the impact for the community. Projects implemented on private properties can complement those on public lands and reduce the need for larger public investments. When designed well, incentive programs can lead to both private investments and best management practices beyond what would have been achieved in the absence of the rebate program. This is known as additionality, and turns private investment into related best management practices technologies that are unsubsidized, known as the acceleration effect. A couple examples of incentives include rebate programs to incentivize the implementation of water conservation and stormwater management practices. So more and more recently, different local governments have been taking this on. For example, the Borough of Westchester in Pennsylvania has implemented a stream protection fee to partially fund its stormwater management system and comply with regulatory permit requirements. The initial fee is directly proportional to the total impervious area of the parcel, and discounts up to 60% of the fee are provided for those that implement green infrastructure practices. In Anne Arundel County, Maryland, there is both a stormwater remediation fee and a stormwater property tax to pay for stormwater management practices. Property owners can receive a credit towards both if they implement practices on their properties to control stormwater runoff. All right. The last cost reducer that I'm really quickly going to touch on are regulations and policy. Policies can be adopted by local jurisdictions to formalize the community's hazard mitigation and water management goals, reduce the capital costs of implementing integrated hazard mitigation plans, and encourage private sector investments in the community. Updating codes, instituting Dig Once policies, and streamlining permitting processes can help advance a community's goals without significant investment of public dollars, and they can even provide a funding stream in the form of enforcement fines, mitigation payments, and in lieu payments. Incorporating updated standards and having local codes that require or allow developers to minimize impervious cover, conserve natural areas, and use runoff reduction practices to manage stormwater runoff help reduce construction costs, leverage private investment for implementing projects with a public benefit, and ensure more resilient communities. In 2014, both the tree canopy law and the county's roadside tree protection law went into effect in Montgomery County, Maryland. Both of these laws establish sediment and control permit requirements, which require limiting disturbance by planting trees or paying fee in lieu into a dedicated account. As of fiscal year 2022, mitigation fees paid because of the tree canopy law totaled $5.4 million. These fees are dedicated for funds for purchasing, installing, and establishing shade trees to enhance shade and canopy, including on private property, multifamily and homeowner association properties, businesses, and schools. The county staffs the Tree Montgomery program, which is the planting program funded through the tree canopy law, and Tree Montgomery staff meet with eligible property owners to select species and locations for shade trees. A contractor then completes all of the planting work, and Tree Montgomery staff inspect each tree after planting. By the end of fiscal year 2022, Tree Montgomery had planted more than 7,300 shade trees. All right, now I'm going to jump into revenue streams, and these are mechanisms that generate and access capital for project implementation. In general, communities rely on two methods of funding and financing infrastructure, either the pay-as-you-go model, which is having cash on hand, or pay-as-you-use model, which is taking on debt. A community's size, geography, land use, legal framework, coverage of government services, and citizens' preferences can all influence its revenue structure. General funds are typically the main source of income for municipal governments and generally come from property income and sales tax. Competing local priorities make it difficult to rely on general funds, leading to unstable resource allocation in many cases. In addition, hazard mitigation and water management costs have been increasing at a higher pace than general funds, and relying exclusively on these will likely prove insufficient. More reliable taxes might include things like selective sales taxes, such as those levied on the sale of certain commodities and services, special assessment taxes, which are local level taxes imposed on residents in order to fund an infrastructure project that will improve their community. This should be linked to the cost of providing the service or infrastructure and applied uniformly to all beneficiaries. There's also tax increment financing districts, in which the costs of improvements are paid back by future tax increases, such as landscape and lighting assessments districts. And lastly, you can consider a special improvement district in which members of the group are assessed fees in order to pay for the desired benefits, such as green spaces and trees. However, in general, taxes will always remain unpopular. An example is in Fairfax, Virginia, where more stringent regulatory requirements and essential reinvestment in the county's aging infrastructure resulted in the need to establish a funding mechanism that was independent of the general fund. So in 2010, they implemented a stormwater tax, which is currently assessed at 3.25 cents per $100 of assessed real estate value. Another revenue stream are fees. Fees differ from taxes in that they are assessed in order to recover some of the cost of providing a service to a beneficiary, rather than simply raising revenue for general funds or disincentivizing undesired activities. Using dedicated fees is preferable because it avoids competing with other programs and needs that compete for general funds. Local governments can levy fees for a variety of reasons. Ideally, in order to be better accepted, fees should be linked directly to the cost of providing the service and used exclusively for that service, as well as applied uniformly and fairly to all beneficiaries. So some examples of fees include permit fees, which are assessed by local governments to raise revenue directly from any proposed development or construction that may worsen stormwater impacts. One that we're likely all familiar with in this audience are drinking water utility fees or wastewater utility fees. The challenging part with setting up these utility fees is establishing a price that covers utility costs while maintaining equity. There are also impact fees, which are traditionally one-time charges to developers used to pay for improvements to services and amenities necessary to serve the new development. These fees have the potential to take into consideration projected environmental impacts due to the development and can be used in part to mitigate such impacts, for example, by incorporating green infrastructure. Also, fee in lieu programs are fees that a developer or other person entity must pay in order to compensate for the environmental impact a development project may have. A couple examples of these fees are, first is from Northampton, New Massachusetts. They established a stormwater and flood control utility in 2014. It is supported by a fee which provides an example of a new funding stream to support integrated stormwater and resilience efforts at a smaller municipal scale. Instead of calculating the fee based on the amount of impervious surface for each property, the average runoff for a single family, 2-family, and 3-family homes was determined, and fees were assessed based on those averages. Another example is from Missouri, which funds its stream mitigation projects with a mitigation requirement for developers that impact streams. Mitigation may include paying into a fee in lieu, and this is sometimes used for stormwater management programs. If there is a retention requirement, at times it can be met by paying the fee in lieu for an increased amount of stormwater storage and infiltration on site. The next revenue stream is debt, bonds, and loans. Debt, either through bonds or loans, is another source of capital for local jurisdictions. Bonds and loans are debt financing used to borrow money to finance a specific project and spread the repayment over time. There are differing attitudes over whether to use a pay-as-you-use strategy, issuing debt and paying off the debt over the project's lifetime, because debt increases the total cost of the asset through interest payments. But it also allows you to save time and build capital projects sooner by borrowing upfront and spreading out payments over a long time, which helps smooth out expenses and create a more predictable flow. Green bonds, also known as climate bonds, are bonds whose proceeds are earmarked specifically for green projects and can be used as a general revenue bond that is backed by a taxing authority of the community or the state. While green bonds do not necessarily represent an additional financing benefit to the community, they signal to the public that the community is committed to environmental improvements and can attract investors who are looking to invest in projects that provide positive environmental and social impacts. Environmental impact bonds are another instrument for financing large projects that pay returns based on outcomes. They are a form of pay for success debt financing. In other words, investors can only collect a return on their investments if the project proves to be successful. They have an additional performance payment made to investors if projects achieve greater than expected performance. So an example of debt financing is in 2019, the Virginia Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund program provided over $20 million in funding for the Cumberland Forest Project. The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, which houses the state's Clean Water Revolving Loan Program, partnered with the Virginia Department of Forestry and the Nature Conservancy to purchase and permanently protect over 22,000 acres in Southwest Virginia to protect source water. This is the largest open space easement ever recorded in Virginia. And last but not least, I am going to talk about everyone's favorite revenue streams, which is grants, because grants are non-repayable funds that are dispersed or gifted by one party to another and are usually used to fund specific programs or projects. The process of winning a grant can be quite competitive and time-consuming and usually requires writing proposals, following strict specific guidelines, which are then evaluated by the funding agency. Funding for grants can come from both the public and private sectors. Grants from the public sector can include federal, state, and publicly funded agencies, while grants from the private sector include foundations, nonprofits, and private for-profit companies. So this this slide shows a resource from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. This is the Federal Resources for Nature-Based Solutions to Climate Change. It was developed in February of 2020. And this fact sheet provides a survey of federal funding and technical assistance available to help state and local governments and agencies, tribes and non-governmental organizations, universities, and individuals implement nature-based solutions for climate resilience. Many of these sources of federal support allow communities to develop projects which draw on multiple interrelated benefits of nature-based solutions. And this fact sheet also identifies the types and attributes of projects the program supports. With several new federal funds being announced since 2020, it is a little bit out of date, but it is still a good starting point, and it gives you a good idea of the breadth of opportunities available to you. Common federal sources that we here at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center are always monitoring are listed on this slide for you. And then most of these agencies have listservs and newsletters that you can enroll in to receive announcements of when grant funding programs open. So now I'm going to transition into some case studies. I have 3 case studies for you, and these are all from water utilities that are using robust planning strategies and combining multiple finance and funding sources. Having a diverse funding portfolio helps these utilities ensure the implementation of projects. The first case study I'm going to go through is the South Monmouth Regional Sewer Authority in New Jersey. And the reason I like this case study is it's an example of a community adapting its planning process to identify funding and financing sources early in its planning process. So the South Monmouth Regional Sewer Authority in New Jersey operates a sewage treatment plant and a conveyance system that services 8 coastal municipalities. The region has recently experienced extreme weather events with significant rehabilitation costs, which you can see on your screen. Some of the impacts of this extreme wet weather includes a temporary loss in sewer service due to power outages, as well as damage to assets, equipment, and infrastructure from flooding, wind damage, and storm surges. So what the Sewer Authority wanted to do was use the disaster relief dollars coming to it, not only to restore service to customers, but also to build back smarter so that they could increase their resilience against future storm events. This is an example of thinking through the funding and financing options available to you early in the planning process. They didn't want to simply build back, but they wanted to build back better by being strategic and by thinking long term. The Sewer Authority went through a robust planning process using EPA's CREATE tool, and CREATE stands for the Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool. The tool allowed the utility to assess the climate-related risks to its assets and operations. By using this tool, the utility better understood the long-term climate conditions they were facing, the timing of the climate events to prioritize planning efforts, and the impacts of climate-related risks to capital improvements. After performing a baseline risk assessment of its current resilience to future threats, the utility developed strategies that build resiliency into projected climate changes. They then populated the CREATE tool with strategies and the associated capital costs. So the strategies that the South Monmouth Regional Sewer Authority focused on were resiliency measures for various pump stations. They focused on the 3 R's for the pump stations, which are raising equipment and buildings to 4 feet above the 500-year floodplain elevation, relocating and rebuilding pump stations outside of the flood zone, and rapid response and recovery by creating mobile enclosures that protect critical pump station components that can be relocated before a storm. They looked at 4 pump stations: the Belmar Pump Station, the Pitney Avenue Pump Station, the Lake Como Pump Station, and the Penn Avenue Pump Station. And one thing that they did, which is really important, is that they looked at resilience. They knew that resiliency should be flexible and unique to each utility and to each asset. So as you can see in these next couple of slides, they utilize a number of different funding and financing sources for each asset. They relied on a mix of federal funds, state loans, and utility reserves. You can also see for each pump station the adaptive implementation projects that they chose, and each pump station differs since they were each assessed differently. So at the Belmar Pump Station, it was converted to a mobile pump station that can be relocated before a storm. They raised all of its equipment to 4 feet above the 500-year floodplain elevation mark, and they installed submersible pumps. For this the pump station replacement was funded with approximately $2.8 million in loans from the state's low rate clean water revolving fund loan program. And this project qualified for principal forgiveness totaling over $528,000 as it addressed damage from Superstorm Sandy and improved resilience for future storms. Including the interest cost savings, the total savings for this project is estimated to be over $1.2 million over the 20-year term of the loan, or 36% of the total project cost. Next up was the Pitney Avenue Pump Station, which was converted to a mobile pump station and which raised all of its equipment to 4 feet above the 500-year flood elevation mark. So the Pitney Pump Station is being funded through both federal and state funding. A state loan is providing approximately $1.53 million in funding through project construction completion, and 90% of that loan is being reimbursed by FEMA. At the Lake Como Pump Station, they decided to relocate the building and to extend the force main and sewer lines. And this was funded both by state's clean water state revolving funds and FEMA, like the previously stated example. So the Lake Como Pump Station got a loan of approximately $2.46 million throughout project construction. FEMA reimbursed the authority 90% of costs, which was approximately $2.22 million, and the authority has utilized that money to repay its loan from the state. And lastly, we can look at the Penn Station pump station, where all they did was raise the electrical equipment, and to get that project done, they had to rely solely on authority reserves. My next case study is from Waterbury, Vermont. One of the strategies that I mentioned earlier in this webinar is how comprehensive planning can be an effective cost reducer. Waterbury, Vermont's wastewater treatment plant was able to implement the state's hazard mitigation efforts at a local level. First, I'll discuss Vermont's statewide hazard mitigation effort. Following Hurricane Irene's destructive path throughout the state in 2011, Vermont's emergency management became proactive in managing natural hazards. The state not only started a buyout effort to purchase flood damaged and flood vulnerable properties in 2012, but more recently started a mitigation initiative that addresses vulnerability in a more comprehensive way by restoring streams and floodplains. Floodplain restoration will conserve critical areas and watershed functions so water can be spread out to low-lying areas after heavy rainfall events, which will benefit not only the natural system, but also reduce the vulnerability of buildings and infrastructure that would have otherwise been in harm's way. The priority actions established in the 2019 Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan were established by a steering committee comprised of multiple stakeholders from multiple state agencies and nonprofit organizations. Since 2012, the state has been able to acquire and demolish close to 160 flood vulnerable properties and complete approximately 70 infrastructure improvement projects. FEMA has funded 75% of the buyouts, and the rest has all come from different federal and state programs. So some of the cost reducers that we see in this Vermont example are municipal bylaws to prevent development in flood-prone areas, alleviating the need for future buyouts, leveraging land where the flood vulnerable or flood damaged structures used to be located and conserving those. The state also developed a flood-ready website, which provides information and resources for communities to plan and implement mitigation projects, including information on funding sources. Revenue streams that the state uses are both from federal and state programs and include FEMA, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Vermont's Ecosystem Restoration Grant Program, and more. And they also have an Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, which is an incentive program to determine the state-based match for municipalities following a declared disaster to repair damaged public infrastructure and to reward communities that have taken mitigation measures. Communities are eligible to receive as much as 17.5% of the cost from the state if they have taken significant flood mitigation measures. So what did Waterbury, Vermont do? Drawing on lessons learned from Hurricane Irene, where there was significant flooding at a pump station that was located within the floodplain, the wastewater utility installed storm-proof doors at the pump station, upgraded to dry pit submersible pumps, added generators, and moved electrical equipment higher in the building. By doing this, they were able to utilize the state's community development grant program to pay for the upgrades. And by securing grant funding for the pump station, Waterbury was then able to use its own savings towards a complete sewer line replacement projects on Main Street. This was a capital improvement project that had been on the books for a really long time, and it cost $22 million, which was funded through a mix of 95% federal, 3% state, and 2% local funds through a Department of Transportation grant. So we at the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center spoke to Bill Woodruff, the Public Works Director in Waterbury, Vermont, for a podcast that we recorded in July of last year. And it's available on the Environmental Finance Center's Network's website, which I encourage you to check out. In the podcast, Bill discusses the resilience projects he installed at the wastewater treatment plant, as well as how they paid for the upgrades. The last case study that I will share with you, for this last case study, I wanted to find a project that dealt with drought instead of flooding. And to do that, I found the city of Wichita Falls in Kansas. The city is increasingly drought prone. So they are constructing a permanent reuse project that will deliver indirect potable reuse water from the River Road wastewater treatment plant to the city's raw source, the Arrowhead Lake. When complete, this project will allow the plant to meet stringent effluent limits that will allow up to 16 million gallons per day of processed wastewater to be added to the lake. This reuse system will provide a long-term solution to assist the city in meeting their source water needs. So this project is being funded through a number of different methods. First, the city's budget was increased by $1 million annually to begin paying for the permitting costs. It is expected that this money will be required for approximately 8 to 10 years. Second, the rates were increased to help replenish nearly $8 million in emergency reserves that were used during the drought when usage was at all-time lows. And that $8 million includes over $4 million of repairs to the water and sewer lines that were deferred during the drought. It will take several years to replenish those emergency reserve funds. And for the major capital, the city borrowed $33 million from the state's Clean Water State Revolving Funds, which has over $252,000 of principal forgiveness. The city of Wichita Falls is anticipated to save approximately $6.8 million over the 30-year loan by using the low interest Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So I know I'm running out of time here. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to share some of the resources that I had touched on earlier in the webinar. So when you get these slides, these resources are all hyperlinked, so you should be able to just click on them when you get a copy of the slides. In conclusion, in this webinar, I discussed the benefits of integrated hazard mitigation and water resources and water resource planning. I covered the difference between financing and funding and outlined a number of different cost reducers and revenue streams and explored examples of how these strategies have been effectively used to pay for project implementation. There is no single solution to funding and financing a community's efforts to address water resource management problems and to reduce the risk of natural hazards. But by looking at these problems in a holistic way and integrating plans, communities can potentially reduce their costs of dealing with these challenges and increase the chances of accessing new sources of financing and funding. Remember early on in the planning process to look for ways to reduce costs, explore opportunities to work with adjacent communities and/or bring the private sector in to provide services in a more efficient way. Remain flexible and assess a variety of funding and financing sources to determine which ones may be accessible and worth implementing given the realities of your particular community. Work to identify potential sources of revenue early in the planning process and understand if there are ways to combine multiple sources. Lastly, prioritize projects in order of urgency and funding potential in order to jumpstart hazard mitigation efforts and get communities working in the right direction towards solving your water management and hazard mitigation challenges. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'll turn it back over to you, Owen.
Awesome. Well, we have a couple questions. I'll just let people know if you do want to view any of these slides within the handouts tab of your GoToWebinar control panel. You can go and download or look through there. So the couple questions that we have so far, the first one was, which year was the South Monmouth pump station funded by FEMA? If you know.
It was, that's a great question. Let me see if I have it in my notes. If not, I can definitely follow up with via email. I wanted to say it was fiscal year 2018, but I can double check that and get back to you.
Awesome. Another question that we got was, what new, if any, federal grants are available for small private water associations dealing with PFAS contamination levels that are above the new EPA drinking water standards?
For PFAS, I believe the EFCs are currently dealing with it through the water TA assistance programs that we're offering right now. I think each state is a little different. And I know you're asking about federal sources of money. I think that's the sources of money I've seen have been wrapped up into the bipartisan infrastructure law handouts that are going on right now. but each state is allocating them a little bit differently since they're all being rolled out through the state's revolving loan fund programs. So that is something I can also follow up on. The person who asked that question, where specifically are they located? If they provided that info.
Yeah, they added Camano Island, Washington.
Washington. Okay. So I would have to look at what Washington State is doing on PFAS, but I can circle back. You said Camano Island.
Yes.
Okay.
As everyone can see too, her email is included in the slides, and you will have that information in the handout as well. So you can always feel free, if I'm assuming you're fine with it, to reach out. Okay, so then we have one more right now. This person just wanted to say, very insightful, particularly when thinking about water and wastewater utility master planning. They were wondering, can you share any tools that are publicly available for utilities to use as they attempt to monetize qualitative impacts?
Yes, I can. I don't, they are, let me look at the, I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick to see if the one I'm thinking of is in the slides I provided. And if not, I can definitely, Owen, follow up with you before you send out those tools. So what I will do is, I don't see one listed right here. So I have a coworker who works in this space a lot. I will ask what tools she uses most, and I will follow up via email with everyone who attended for the tools that she uses.
Awesome, sounds good. I didn't know, anyone else have any other questions?
So when I just want to quantifying the co-benefits, right?
Yes.
Okay, tools for quantifying. Awesome, I can follow up.
Okay, well, I haven't gotten anything else in, so we can wrap it up here. A huge thank you to Natalia for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar so that you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan for future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCM events.
Thank you, Owen.